God's creation is beautiful and majestic, from mountains to trees to rivers, but the desert has a beauty all its own. And when you think of Colorado, you probably don't think of the desert. But the National Sand Dunes in Colorado are the largest sand dunes in North America, and they are surrounded by an impressive mountain range. And these sand dunes are epic. In fact, they've even done filming here using these sand dunes as a setting for the planet Mars. Truly, they are an amazing part of God's creation. But can you imagine wandering around in this desert, lost for 40 years? That's what the Israelites did in the time between the Exodus, when God led Israel out of Egyptian bondage, and before they went into the Promised Land. They spent 40 years wandering in the desert, lost. And at one point, they said, "We are lost. We are all going to die." If you've never spent time in the desert, aimless, lost, you will. Times in the desert are hard. The wind whips your face. The sun beats down and chaps your lips and your face, and you get that weather-worn look. And during the time of the coronavirus, so many have felt lost, aimless, not knowing where to go or what to do, experiencing job losses, lost hopes, lost dreams, and some, sadly, have even lost loved ones. In our younger years, we can sometimes feel lost, not knowing which direction to go in our lives. As we go through life, we may experience significant life change, and that can create questions of identity and purpose. Job loss, kids going off to college, empty nest, retirement, all of these significant changes in our lives can create times of wandering and questioning and wondering where God is in all of this. It can even lead sometimes to a loss of faith. But God has always used times in the desert to shape His people and to mold them into the people that He wants and calls them to be. So how then do we get through these desert times? Well, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the book of Numbers chronicles the wilderness wanderings of the people of Israel. And it's a story filled with grumbling and complaining. But interspersed within this story are some important life lessons about how to get through desert times. The story begins at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God had given to Moses the 10 Commandments, telling His people how He called them to live. And the Lord ordered a census of all the people of Israel. And with women and children, this would have numbered 2 to 3 million people, a vast nation. And then God began to give instructions to the people of Israel, telling them things which would help them through this desert time and this time of wandering. First, God had them organize themselves around family units, telling them to gather around their family banner. I don't know if we have a family banner, but that sounds pretty cool. But the point was that He was telling them that they would need family to help them through this time. Israel would spend 40 years in the desert. But I'm sure even during that time, children played together, parents loved their children, they loved and depended upon one another, and we can do the same. We also see in this story that God was at the center of the camp, literally and figuratively. The tent of meeting was where the tabernacle was placed, and this was a place where God had specially chosen to locate His presence. And this was located at the center of the camp. And God gave specific instructions to all the tribes and families of how they were to surround this tent of meeting. And God designated one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, to be special servants, whose job it was to take care of the tent of meeting, to set it up, and to do the work of the Lord. And rather than working out in the fields in other ways, they would be supported by all the other tribes. And from this tribe of Levi, God designated a line of priests descended from Aaron. And these priests were to give instructions on holiness and to offer sacrifices to God on behalf of the people. And one of the significant blessings that's found in the book of Numbers that God gave through Aaron was this: "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause His face to shine upon you and give you peace." Recently in Israel, there were found scrolls with tiny fragments of this ancient blessing. which shows that this was a significant prayer and blessing, which goes all the way back to the book of Numbers and was passed down from generation to generation. Israel was also during this time to depend upon God to know when and where to move in the desert. God located His presence in the tent of meeting, which contained the Ark of the Covenant. And over this tent of meeting was a cloud, which lit up at night like fire. And Israel was instructed to move when the cloud moved, and to stay put when the cloud stayed put. In some ways, this may have created some uncertainty with human plans, not knowing how long to stay in a place or how long you would be there. Certainly, though, it would have caused them to look to God for direction. And we can do the same today. Sure, it'd be nice to have a cloud telling us when to move or when to stay, but we can go to God in prayer and seek His direction in our lives and make our human plans very lightly. During this time, God also gave them rituals and traditions, giving them structure, order, and stability in their lives. One of the things that has been challenging during the time of the coronavirus has been the taking away of so many predictable routines and practices that we've had in our lives. And so it can be helpful to put some structure back in. Even though Israel would spend 40 years in the desert, God would give them instructions on how to worship, on the weekly observation of the Sabbath day, in which they were to do no work and to rest and depend upon God to work for them, and the yearly observance of the Passover and other feasts to remind them of the power of God and how He had redeemed them and how He had been faithful in the past and would be faithful in the future. Worship, memorials, tradition, all of these things can be helpful for us as we go through challenging times. And God would also prepare His people for these wilderness wanderings by giving them leaders. First of all, He appointed Moses as His leader over them. God gives to us leaders during times of crisis and change. When we feel lost, we can hopefully turn to them, knowing and believing that they are looking to God for guidance. Finally, God provided for His people while they were in the desert, giving them food, giving them water, giving them His presence, giving them everything that they needed. Unfortunately, Israel spurned all these blessings, and they failed every step along the way. Moses had his own family. Aaron and Miriam, his brother and sister, turned against him. Some failed to keep the Sabbath, and they lost their lives because of this. They didn't look to God for guidance, and they rebelled against Him time and time again. 12 spies from Israel were sent into the land of Canaan to look over the land, as Israel was about to invade the land of Canaan and claim it as the promised land of Israel. And those 12 spies brought back a report saying that it is indeed a good land filled with milk and honey. But there are giants there, and we are but grasshoppers in their eyes. We cannot possibly defeat these enemies. Of those 12 spies, only Joshua and Caleb had faith and trusted that God would indeed be with them and help them to utterly defeat their enemies. At this point, God is so frustrated with Israel, they've rebelled against Him 10 times, that He does indeed decide to destroy them and to start over and to give Moses a new people to work with. But Moses intercedes on their behalf, and God relents. But He pronounces judgment on the people there, saying that they would spend 40 years out in the desert, that current generation would all die, and it would only be their children that would enter into the promised land. And Moses himself would not be allowed to enter into the promised land. Moses overstepped his bounds, did not follow God, and so he would be able to see the promised land, but not ever enter into it. But God would indeed raise up the next generation of leaders, and Joshua would lead the people of Israel into the promised land, and there they would claim it as their own. God would fulfill His promise that He made to Abraham so many years before. So now, how about you? What are times in your life where you felt lost? What has helped you through these times? And what do you feel that God is calling you to do to help you better find your pathway to Him? May God bless you in this faith journey.